Hello and welcome to this talk on Sidereal versus the tropical zodiac. And this is going to be a study in the use of a specific yoga. There's been a lot of internet astrologers these days, maybe some others outside of the internet, starting to use the tropical zodiac with the sidereal zodiac for nakshatras, tropical for signs. And there hasn't been, the claims are that it works better in their systems. However, there hasn't been a lot of, or any that I know of, actual research that they've provided. So, and they bring up some really interesting arguments and topics for their claims. And I've dabbled, I've looked in it before, but I just started getting interested in more, so I started digging it through and decided to test it. So this is my kind of first introductory research into this usage, and I'm just hoping that this will get other people to look at these principles and a more clear, concise manner. But I think once we go through all the slides, some things will be very clear as far as these usages go, at least in what I've been studying. So to get into the beginning, the basic background is, there's this whole idea that there's two zodiacs. In the ancient Vedic text, there are obvious references to tropical, to sidereal, and the uses of them. We're not going to be dealing at all with Western astrology, Western uses of the tropical zodiac. They have their own system, and this is not a comment on that system and how it works. I know very, very little of Western astrology. So this is purely, based in Vedic teachings and how this works with the zodiacs and which one will work best for, the principles outlined in our Shastra. So most astrologers these days, anyone who calls himself Vedic or properly who practicing Jyotish, will use sidereal rashis and nakshatras together. And what these neo-Vedic astrologers are starting to do is to calculate the rashis per the tropical zodiac and calculate the nakshatras and the sidereal. And so this is one issue that comes up. The other is the issue of Ainamsha, which is the difference between tropical and sidereal, which is more of a Vedic concern. The calculating tropical rashis kind of leaves that out, except for the nakshatra placements. I'm not going to get too into this debate. I don't care to engage in it, and for quite a lot of reasons, but just you can look it up if you're interested. However, keep in mind when you do look at that research, and a lot of the backing for it is taken from a lot of random sources, and it's good work and it's intriguing work, and it's why I was interested in the topic to begin with. However, a lot of their interpretations are coming out of reading the text straight without a teacher, without a proper teacher interpreting it on their own terms. In a lot of Sanskrit texts, especially the old texts, you can't just take a dictionary and your background as a Westerner and plug it in and figure it out. It's not. There's a lot buried in the Sanskrit text, and there's a lot of cultural implications and other things that make it really hard to decipher it. So that's one thing there. The other thing is that a lot of those arguments are based on this idea that somehow the Vedic system lost the knowledge of the Ainamsha and the difference between the tropic and the sidereal zodiac. However, there's ample evidence that India, the Greeks, Mesopotamia, that the Arab astrologers, that they all had continued interchange and interaction throughout the years, and there's really no good evidence that understanding of the difference was lost per se. And so this has not really been addressed by their arguments. Once again, I don't want to get into this whole debate because I like to give the benefit of the doubt. But these are just some of the things that I've looked into, and I'm not claiming 100% accuracy. So that's why this testing of the theories has come up, and I'll let this research speak for itself, and I'll be interested to see what comes out of it. Now, looking to researching in astrology, there's not a lot that really meets the snuff of proper, scientific researches, and there's a lot of very good reasons for this. One of the biggest one is that different teachers have very different systems, and very different rules for interpreting horoscopes, and so we need to understand some of those backgrounds and set parameters. So even though this is a study based on principles I've learned, it may not pertain to how someone else is looking at a horoscope, and there's a lot of reasons for that as well. But that's one of the issues. Another big issue is that many people often use very subjective measures and interpretations in what they're speaking about. So if you see a lot of astrology going on these days, it's very loose. It's like, oh well, Saturn's in Capricorn, and so you kind of mix the indications of what that might mean, and it's not very exacting, and so things get very muddled quite often. And I get that, and I do that as well sometimes. So I'm not saying that I'm guilt free of that, but that can create a very big issue in interpretation, and it's a sign of kind of a beginning approach to looking at a chart, and a very basic approach to looking at a chart. But when you get into it, there is a lot of fine principles at play engaging a chart. However, the next issue is that there is a wide variety of factors in making final statements about a horoscope. So, there's so many tools in an astrologer's bag, and oftentimes that can lead one to kind of pick those tools out to explain, their interpretation or why they're getting what they're getting. I've also seen this excuse used for why things haven't been tested in this debate between Vedic and tropical, that you have to learn my techniques before we can prove this. And to a certain extent that's true, but you can at least make a beginning, lay out your basic parameters, and start testing some simple things to begin with, because a lot can still be seen in the Rashi chart. That's the tricky thing, is you need to be pretty exact of what you're looking for and how it lines up, which is not always easy depending on where you're getting your information. Another thing is people interested in healing methods are, they're often suffering, so they are looking for answers. So there is a certain, it's hard to gauge feedback from other people, from clients. Oftentimes, astrology can be quite nebulous, so it can really paint a different picture on things. And so, to give a practical example, is like yoga or Ayurveda, for example. Similar things happen where people sense energetic shifts in their body, and because they're so new to how their body works and paying attention to it, they think, oh wow, I've got energy after I do that. That must be a good thing, and there's a lot of subtle nuances to what's actually going on with all of this stuff, but it's hard to really interpret it properly, if it's healthy, if it's correct information, if it's what you should be doing. So there's a lot of parameters in that. Jyotish especially can be a very tricky subject when you're dealing with people's lives and trying to give them a direction and how that's colored. And so you have to be careful with it, because you are playing with people's karma. Other practical implications is that there's lack of accurate birth time, can create all sorts of issues. So people don't pay attention to this enough in their daily lives. So oftentimes it's hard to get an accurate birth time, and chart rectification is very difficult. So to do mass sampling and mass research on lots of different charts, you have to check each birth time, and you can't sit there and rectify 1,000 charts. It'd be mind-numbing. So that's a big issue in proper research. And then along with that, lack of significant size samples. So you need to get a significant statistical example of these charts, you need to look at a lot of charts and really do a lot of data mining on them. And so doing some of that, and not just cherry picking examples that kind of fit what you're talking about is a big issue. So we'll get into some more of that later, especially because we are looking at a specific area. Another thing is misunderstanding of text or properly applying concepts to charts. Once again, this gets into like interpretation of texts and having wildly different teachings on a text. And another big issue with this today is people, especially if you're floating around the internet or just reading all these books out there on the subjects, each teacher has their own kind of approach, and it's very easy to get very confused very quickly, especially with Jyotish, because there's so many rules and different ways to look at it. So it's really important to find a relationship with a teacher or find a relationship with some teachings that, speak to your viewpoint, but that's also rooted in some kind of tradition, hopefully something with many years of experience with testing these principles. And so the principles and the teachings that I'll be presenting are based off the work of Sanjay Rath, who is head of a lineage that goes back hundreds of years. His work is very fascinating. So that's where a lot of this stuff is coming out of. And I don't claim to represent his parampara or anything, but there's a lot of depth there that that's not being openly taught out in the public these days. That just so that's what we're coming out of, and I'll give the parameters that we'll be working out of soon, so you can test this depending on what you use. Then another big one is lack of understanding how to gauge what is being looked at. It takes a lot of depth and insight into human nature, into society, into philosophy, into understanding the Vedic constructs of life in order to understand the text, but also how to apply it to, what you see in front of you these days. And so because of that, it's really handy or really important having someone from that culture, knowing how these texts were in the historical framework, in the historical context, and how that applies to kind of what we look at these days. And also having that philosophical basis and understanding. And it can be a subtle thing, but it does take a lot of depth and experience with that, so that your vision is very clear. And it involves intense sadhana and meditation and all these other adjunct things. It's not and it's not just a straightforward linear approach to looking at things. It's not a perfectly straight science in a lot of regards. So it's a tricky thing. And the other aspect of that too is, having proper understanding of the planets, what to represent, the feeling for them. And this is another thing where it gets into, you'll see very different teachings on this, and even subtle shifts in those meanings of planets, if they're kind of in the wrong direction, can create a lot of confusion in looking at a chart. And so this is a very, very big issue when not only doing research, but just understanding charts for yourself. So one other thing to consider. And then the last thing I want to touch on, and is a big overview for issues in research, is that details of natives' lives are not always known or understood. So when we're looking at charts, yes, it's good to start with your loved ones and people because you do know a lot of details about their lives. One thing that is a caution is oftentimes, it's hard to properly gauge those people, however, because you do know them so well. So you can oftentimes get slanted in a certain direction. And so this is why it's often recommended, even if you are an astrologer, you should have someone else you go to read your chart to give you more of a balanced opinion instead of practicing on yourself. So it's a slippery slope. And the other thing is, when you're looking at charts of other people, famous personalities that you may know some details of a life, it's often hard to really get those details and know a person really in depth, and understanding the full implications of their life. And this is particularly true if you're doing charts of like celebrities or just random news stories. You might pick up a story about somebody. So those are okay for applying, specific principles to, but to get a really good feel for how the whole chart's working, it's a little trickier, which brings us to my own research parameters for this research. And part of why I chose the topic I did was I chose extremely well recognized intellectuals, like top thinkers who have really impacted humanity or their field with their thought. And I've done this for a lot of different reasons. I'm just very interested in it. The other reason is that these are people who you can get a really good insight into how their minds are working, how their brains are working, from the work they've done, from the output they've produced. A lot of these people have produced just voluminous amounts of work, and their mind is always on their work, which will play into the yoga we're going to be looking at. So what we're looking at and the person itself is very strongly tied together, and so we can really learn a lot about these people if you study these works. And the way I went about choosing them too was very random in a certain sense, in that these were people I just felt were exemplars of their craft. And I did not look at any of their charts pre-hand to look for these yogas that we're going to be looking for. So I had no knowledge if it was in there or not, but I just felt this person should be in my study, and picked them. And then we started looking at the principles. So this is not a pre-planned, pre-picked out look at these charts. It'll be interesting to see what comes up. It's very, very interesting to see the stark difference between the two different systems. The other thing I chose was having an accurate birth time. So, there were some people I was thinking about including, but since the birth time was a little too questionable for my purposes, I just left it out. And I think that's a good general approach to research, because rectifying is too hard. So these are generally either some type of A rating in the Rodin scale, or I think I used 1B with Nikola Tesla. It was out of his biography, and even there I look at different ascendants. So that was one other basic premise. I'm focusing just on the Rashi chart and basic principles. So we don't want to get all complicated, because once you start bringing in more and more principles, then you have more and more things to kind of explain your point and why it's working, and warp the logic. So I've tried to keep this basic so that even beginners can understand this. Even if you have a very basic knowledge of Jyotish, you'll still be able to start to see what I'm talking about here, and I've laid it out very succinctly for you. And so even though a lot of these other parameters will play an effect for why this person is a great genius and not another person, still the principles will apply to these charts. Once again, close ascendants scrutinized, so a couple ascendants were pretty close, so I bring that up and we look at the different possibilities there. Most, though, in general, I try to leave out close ascendants, so that would not be an issue. They use standard equal house system and mean nodes for those calculations. Standard equal house is, the Rashi Bhava that Parashara gives. There are other ways to calculate the houses, and I do recognize those, and they are laid out in the text, but they have specific uses for what they're telling you about the individual, what you're telling you about the native. But the standard Rashi chakra is the starting point for all that understanding and why we're using it here. And that's a whole topic unto itself. So that's what we're using. Ketu and Rahu, co-rulership is clearly laid out in Parashara and some other texts, that Ketu is co-ruler of Scorpio and Rahu is co-ruler of Aquarius. So we will be using that principle in here. There are other uses for exalted places and Mula Chakrona for these planets that I do use. I'll mention them briefly in there, but it won't be a strong basis for what we're looking at. But these rulerships are pretty standard, and I know some people do not use them. Even some of the people who are using the tropical system, I don't know why they throw that out, and it works really well, and it's important detail to use in your chart readings. So we'll be using that here. And then the central key we'll be using to understand this is called Deonta Yoga. And this is an association of the ascendant lord, the Lagna lord, or the Lagna, and rulers of the third, the fifth, or the sixth houses. And we'll get into this in the next slide. I'll explain what that is and why it's going to apply to these charts. The second one is the significator Jupiter and Mercury. Those are the primary karakas, both for this yoga as well as intelligence, which we'll get into. Parivartana will be considered, and this is when two rulers exchange signs, and this creates a very strong sambandha, a very strong association between those planets and those houses involved, one of the strongest. So this can't be overlooked in any general chart interpretation because it does have a very strong effect. Along with that, I'll be looking at some hemming and some other things that will have an effect as well. But this one in particular is powerful. The next thing is sign aspects of the planets. So sign aspects is one of these areas where there's different teachings out there as well. And once again, a deep aspect of the chart and an important aspect taught in Parashara, modified by Jaimini. Some people don't attribute it to Parashara, but it's very clear if you understand that text. He uses it a lot to explain other principles, that it's a central facet of his system. Lots of other things on that too, and I may make a video on the Jaimini Parashara connection, but for the purposes of this study, sign aspects, hopefully you're familiar with them. If not, look up I've got a short video on that, but the basic idea behind that is that Rashi aspects represent resources that the person has, that the planets have, that they're signifying, and they function irregardless of Dasha systems. Because the Rashis are created by the sun, and the sun is a giver of resources. Everything, the whole creation, even if you just look at physics, comes from the sun basically. And so this is the more ideological aspect of why Rashi aspects work. Graha, or the planetary aspects, represent a desire, and so those function, and those are lit up by the different dasha periods. So those are something that are coming and going. So those will not be used within these calculations, within these principles. They will have an effect as the person goes through lives, but we're not going to be considering that, and we can stay away from the dasha systems. And that is one other aspect which we're not taking into account, is the dasha systems, which can light up and highlight certain yogas at different times. And most people run to Vimshotari to do that. However, I would advise you to start looking at Naisargika Dasha, which is the foundational planetary. It's based on the ages of the planets, and this is the natural dasha cycle that goes for all humans, and it works really well. But it's also the foundational dasha system, and so you should start your understanding with that, and then you can apply Vimshotari, which has more to do with it's based on the moon and the mind, and how that's interfacing with the person. The other thing with the Nasargika Dasha is that generally, if you live to at least 70, you're going to see the age of all the planets. Your yogas will fructify in some manner, no matter what, and it can take different, lots of different variations on that. But I'm not going to be looking at those systems. But if you are wondering how it works, I would suggest that as a good starting point to see how this lines up with the movement over time. And it's a really beautiful system, works really well. I will caution you though, there is different opinions on how to calculate the sub-dashas for that, and I'm not going to get into that here. The ones I use personally are the calculations given in the latest Sri Jyotish Star, but that's all I'll say for now on that. Planets and quadrants support each other. So planets and quadrant, they share the same guna. So they oftentimes will really help in getting things done, so to speak. That's a subtle point, but it does come up quite often. Lastly, we're not going to be looking at these too much, but the Manta Yoga can also be seen from the Aruda Lagna and the Atmakaraka, and this can give a lot more details about what's going on with the planet. So even though the Manta might be in the chart, which shows the person is a good intellectual or researcher, whether or not that becomes someone's profession or it's their calling in life, or if, they get recognized for it, those are all separate factors that need to be weighed in. We're just looking at, one basic yoga here to see how it's working for now without getting too complicated. So the next step for this is understanding this yoga that we're gonna center around. The whole thing is about D, which is our intellectual function, and so we need to have our philosophical understanding of it before we start looking at it in the chart, so that we see how it's applied and understand the basis of it. Basically, the lagna, the ascendant, is seen as the seat of intelligence. So, this comes through its association as first house, or the natural sign Aries is the brain, and the intelligence functions through the brain. And, this gives a strong direction with how the person interprets, it sees the world. And I'm not going to get into different definitions of intelligence, which is a whole nother aspect of deeper considerations, which I'll look at the end of this. For now, that's the working definition we're working with. And Jupiter and Mercury are very important planets for this function, because those are the planets that get directional strength in the ascendant. And they can also be seen as significators for these functions of the third, the fifth, and the sixth house. And the fifth house is obvious from the Jupiter connection, but the third and sixth house, in the natural zodiac, are ruled by Mercury, being Gemini and Virgo, which is where those associations come in. And basically, 6 is also the exaltation of Mercury, as well as Rahu in the tradition I'm studying out of. It's Mula Trikona. So this gives one a very research-focused mind. And 10th from that is the third, which is showing the work of the researcher. Third house can have to do with writing and our output in the world. So another Mercury association. And the most important thing here is that both of these houses are upachaya, they're growth houses. And so anyone who's a very strong intellectual or researches is constantly asking questions and refining their understanding of the world and what it means to, interact and be a being in the world. So these are very critical houses. It's a little different from the 8th house, which does have some research associations. But for this specific yoga, these are the primary functions because of that Mercury connection as well. The 5th house connection can be seen through how the 4th house is the basic house of learning. And intelligence is seen as a 5th house function, because the second house from the 4th is the 5th, which is the fruit of that learning with those second house connections. It's not, some people try to attribute 4th house as primary learning and 5th house is like university learning, which is really not supported in the text. And then a Deonta, the definition of it is basically someone who's really focused on understanding and they're acquiring knowledge. And it can be people of a similar disposition, but we're really focusing to this group of researchers, scientists, intellectuals, top people that are really, really recognized. Once again, 3-6 is more research orientated, asking questions, and 5th is a little more about acquiring knowledge, kind of storehousing it, if you will. Important distinction to make too is that if the ascendant lord is only in the 3rd, 5th, or 6th house, the person may want knowledge, but unless the lord of that specific house is somehow associated with either the ascendant, which is the seat of the intelligence, or the ascendant lord, which is that applied intelligence, unless those two things connect somehow, that it doesn't indicate that person is a Deonta, that they're going to be a deep researcher. So what we're looking for is connections between these lords and the ascendant lord. And the more connections, and a lot of astrology is finding confluence and more connections. So the more these connections we find, the stronger we can say that the Deonta yoga is being activated. And if you want more details on this whole thing, Visti Larson is an excellent astrologer. So he wrote a paper on this, and you can visit his website and check it out. And he gives a lot more other indications and details and way to look at different functions of intelligence past just this one. But we're pulling this principle just for this sake, and it's coming out of a specific application out of Jaimini that he's derived there. And we'll also be looking as a secondary consideration. So once again, we're looking at confluence. So Parashara does give some indications for people with high knowledge that come out of the Bhavalore chapters. So this is a chapter in Parashara. It's a really, really key central chapter that's not widely understood out there these days, where he goes through each house ruler and says, fifth lord in fifth house, fifth lord in sixth house, fifth lord in seventh house, and gives all these indications for what that might mean. And normally what I see these days is, people take that understanding and they don't really look at what Parashara is detailing there. And what he's teaching there are really specific principles based on that lord. And it can be a little tricky to tease those out, once again, without a teacher, without someone who has a deeper understanding of the text. And so what a lot of people do nowadays is they just combine the basic indications and often ignore a lot of exactly what Parashara is talking. But that chapter is very deep and so many connections can be made there. But we will be looking at a couple indications he gave there, which included the fifth lord or the fourth lord in the 11th. As well as the fourth lord in the 7th, giving one a good knowledge of texts and a broad knowledge base and a research base. So I'm not going to get into details, but once again, that'll be a side thing, but we'll just see where it comes up in chart as extra confirmation of this person's intelligence. So to begin with, it's only proper to start with, perhaps the man that is associated most with being a genius in our time, at least, and that's Albert Einstein. I think he's kind of the poster boy for this kind of thing. So if Deont is working, I think his chart would give us a huge hint if sidereal or tropical is working better with this one basic principle. So we'll begin on the left with the sidereal system. So to begin with, we see that the ascendant lord Mercury has gone to the 10th house. Once again, Mercury's one of the Karaka planets. It's one of the lords, and you'll see this coming up time again. Mercury or Jupiter is somehow influencing with the ascendant. So important detail to note. It's gone to the 10th house, and it's sitting there with the 3rd and the 5th lord, which are Venus and Sun. Sun being in Digbala, Venus is exalted. So, these dignities help boost up Mercury. Sun's in a little low degree, which gives some trickiness, but we're not going to get into a lot of interpretive principles. We're just trying to stick straight to the facts here. We have a lot of charts to get through, so I just want to point out what's going on. Then we also see that we have an exalted 6th lord Mars, which is in the 8th house, and that's just an important detail because it's hemming Jupiter there. So we can see how all these planets are hemming, the other Karaka for this yoga, and all are somehow involved in pressing on that Jupiter. And Jupiter is further associated with this yoga because there is a parivartana, once again, between Saturn and Jupiter. And so the basic teaching idea behind that is, from this tradition at least, is that when planets exchange signs like that, they're often seen to act as if they were in their own house. And it also, when any planet is in their own house, it raises it to the tattva level, the elemental level. So that planet gets a huge boost. It's not just an ordinary planet. So this is a very strong sambandha. So very clearly, all these lords and the Karakas are associated within the sidereal chart. Now, if we look to the tropical chart, we see that the ascendant lord is the moon, and it's gone to the 6th house, which is, once again, it is a Deonta house, but unless there's some association with one of the 3, 5, or 6 lords, then we can't really consider it a full Deonta yoga. And we see that Jupiter is aspecting that house with Rahu in its own house, as well as aspecting the Lagna. So there is some association there. However, as far as the Deont yoga goes, that's it. There's no more associations there. So we can see that clearly in this example, the chart on the left, the sidereal chart, is working much more strongly than the tropical chart in reference to applying the Deont yoga. And one more thing to note too is the dignity of the planets in the tropical chart are just sorely lacking from the sidereal chart. So you'll see, Jupiter has gone from the very auspicious 9th house into the 8th house with Rahu, quite a bit weaker there. We see the sun has lost its Digbala position in the 10th house, moved to the 9th house, which isn't a bad position, but still not directional strength. Saturn is debilitated there. Mercury doesn't get the Nicha Bhanga Raja Yoga. Venus is not exalted. It's in a Martian sign, not doing so hot. Those dignities are just much, much weaker here. Mars is still exalted, but overall, I think it's very clear that, the tropical really doesn't explain Einstein's genius. And if anybody, typifies genius, I think this chart would be a very strong starting point and example. But one chart does not prove anything. So in the next video, we're going to start looking across a bunch of different charts and people in different fields to apply this and see how it's working. And just as a preview, what I've been finding is this stark contrast is pretty typical as we look across charts, but it's really interesting to see how it's working. So please continue on with the video if you're interested in this topic. It's pretty fascinating, and these are fascinating people, so as well as their charts. So thank you for listening to this. Any questions or comments, please get in touch, and hope to see you in the next video.